Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Raiders of the Sands by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 18, Drowned in the Red Sea. Abraham had never known heat like it, not even down in the valley of the terrible river. They had been picking their way for 3 days now down the vast, steep mountainside that separates high Ethiopia from the coastal lowlands. With each step, the air was becoming heavier and wetter and hotter, and Abraham and the other Highlanders weren't used to it, nor were the poor donkeys. Dr. Ponset was having terrible trouble with his shoes. It was bad enough for the others with their nimble bare feet, but he had cheered everyone up by taking his hair off. Instead, he was wearing a huge straw hat. Before they could see a sandy plain dotted with trees. Then one of the old donkey drivers shouted out, "The sea! The sea!" Far beyond was a hazy shimmer. The children all squinted at it through the sun, but it didn't really look like anything, unless you knew. 3 days later, they were standing sweltering next to it, an endless stretch of blue water, bigger than the children could ever have imagined. "I can't believe we're going to cross that," muttered Abraham to Leah, who was standing next to him with her cloak around her head, still in donkey boy disguise. A few little gifts to the other donkey boys had made sure that they didn't pass her secret to the caravan leader and Dr. Ponset, and the 9 other noble children had sworn to keep it too. Dr. Ponset didn't seem to think much of the boats. He marched up and down the harbor edge, shouting and waving his arms about. "Look at those drows. Not a nail in any of them anywhere. Planks tied together with ropes. For God's sakes. And look at those monstrous sails. Coconut leaf mats. Would you believe it? Far too heavy and rough for the crew to move safely. And what about the mast? Oh, what are we supposed to do with a single mast if it breaks in a storm, eh? In any case, we're all far too small." In the end, he found an Indian-built boat with 2 masts and cotton sails instead of the local Arab dhow, and the cargo was loaded onto it. Now was the moment the 2 children had been dreading. The load bearers and the donkey drivers and all of the servants, except for Dr. Ponset's 2 special ones, were not needed any longer, and were about to be paid off and sent home. Leah picked up a stray package, and she and Abraham and the other children walked steadily up the gangplank on board the ship. Then she pretended to be busy behind a pile of cargo in the hold. Abraham watched Ponset paying the men on the shore and saying goodbye. The line of men in front of him was moving oh so slowly, but at last there were only 2 left. "We'll be leaving soon, I think," he hissed to Leah, but suddenly the ship's mate came past her, stopped, and pulled her up on deck. "Don't forget this one," he shouted across at the caravan leader. The caravan leader squinted at her across the fierce sunlit light and called, "Come on, boy! We're all off for home now." Leah grabbed hold of a piece of the rigging and shouted back, "I'm not going home. I'm going with the ship." The caravan leader looked at Dr. Ponset in bewilderment and started to explain the delay to him as best he could. Abraham dashed to the ship's side and called to him. "Come over here, sir, if you please. Come right on board." The puzzled doctor did as he was asked. "Dr. Ponset, that's my sister, you know. How much she wants to come with me. How much I want her to come." "But your father has forbidden it." "My mother knows. She helped us." The doctor sighed. "I don't know. What will your father say?" "He'll never see you again. Please, Dr. Ponset." And Leah called across from where she was clinging to the ship's rigging, "Please, Dr. Ponset." "Oh, very well. Come with us." And he clumped back down to the harbor and told the caravan leader, He isn't one of yours? He's coming with us." The morning wore on. and the sticky heat was becoming unbearable. Dr. Ponset bustled around the harbor and the boat, back and forth across the gangplank, getting pinker and shinier every minute. "Dr. Ponset, why don't you have a swim in the sea to cool down?" said Abraham innocently. Dr. Ponset gave him a hard look. "It's salt water, don't you know? It just makes you sticky. Besides, I can't swim. But you go ahead. We're not setting sail for a while." Abraham looked down at the sparkling blue water below the ship's sides. It was so clear that he could see tiny stones on the bottom, some 15 or 20 feet below, and the great flocks of bright little fish darted this way and that. He shook his head. "No thanks, I can't swim either." Instead, Abraham and the other children practiced walking across the deck. Although the sea was calm, they could feel the roll of the waves and the little ship rocking beneath their feet, a strange, unbalancing sort of feeling. Finally, the doctor was back on board after paying everyone off. The cargo was stowed, the crew were hoisting the sails, and by now Abraham and Lahia were too excited to be sad. The caravan men were sitting in the shade watching, waiting to wave goodbye before going off and spending their money. Suddenly, there was a commotion over by the harbor entrance. Two men, travel-stained and panting, came running across and called to the caravan men. "Is that the Frankish doctor's ship?" They barely waited for a reply, but raced across the gangplank and on board the ship. They were two men from Fair's court. "Where's Lahia?" But Lahia had already jumped down into the cargo hold and was crouching behind a sack of coffee beans. "Lahia!" called one. "Your father commands you come back. You are not to be punished, but come here, wherever you are." One of the younger children suddenly burst into tears. The men strode over to him, squatted down at his face level, and asked again, "Where is Lahia?" The boy, sobbing, pointed down into the hold, and the two men were down there in a few strides. "Let me go! Let me go! I'm not going home! I'm not! Let me go!" They came up with Lahia, wriggling and lashing out between them. "Listen, I have gold. I can give you gold. I have all my jewelry. Let me go with my brother." One of the men flung her over his shoulder, and they marched back to the shore. The other man picked up the flimsy gangplank and threw it onto the ship, and started to untie the mooring rope, shouting, "Go! Set sail!" The captain looked inquiringly at Dr. Ponset. The doctor shrugged. "Yes, set sail." Abraham stood at the ship's side and called at the two men, standing on each side of the girl, their arms firmly linked with hers. "Don't take her yet. We haven't said goodbye. Lahia, don't be afraid for me. I'll be all right. I really will. Look after mother. And one day I will come back. I promise I will. Goodbye, Lahia." But Lahia just stood and sobbed with terrible shaking, silent sobs. Two sailors pushed the little ship off. The wind filled her sails, and she moved away from the harbor side. The 5 girls and the other 4 boys stood clutching each other, looking wildly back at the land they were leaving. But Abraham stood alone at the ship's stern, calling, "Goodbye, Lahia. I'll never forget you. Goodbye." The two men relaxed their hold. Suddenly, Lahia broke free from them, and Abraham, with horror, saw her run to the water's edge with a cry of, "Wait for me!" rip off her cloak, and plunge in. Her first strokes were strong. She splashed bravely against the waves. Desperation drove her forward. Abraham and the other children, Dr. Ponset, his servants, and the crew stood as if turned to stone, staring. Not one of them could swim. The captain started to bring the ship about, and Abraham called out, "She's going to make it! She's going to make it! Keep going, Lahia! You're going to make it!" And Fair's two men, in spite of themselves, willed her to reach the ship. But it was no use. The ship was already too far from the dock. She swallowed water and choked. Her arms and legs grew tired. She sank and struggled to the surface again. Abraham suddenly pulled off his cloak too and started to clamber over the side of the boat. I'm going in. So what if I can't really swim? At least I'm better at it than she is. But Dr. Ponset grabbed him and pulled him back. No, my boy, no. There's no sense in two deaths. And as Abraham stood panting in Dr. Ponset's grip, Lahia, at last, sank slowly down, 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 beneath the dazzling clear blue waves. That's the end of chapter 18.